There is no king watching you from the stars. That's the first lie they ever told you, back when you were young enough to believe anything that sparkled. Go ahead, look up right now. I'll wait. There's nobody up there keeping an eye on your choices. No father in the clouds. No wisdom whispering down through the dark. What's actually up there is silence, vacuum, nothing. And what happened on that savannah was never magic either. From the very first frame, it was a clinical tragedy wearing a costume made of stardust, so a child could fall asleep without ever knowing what they'd really just watched. I need you to forget, just for the next half hour, everything you think you know about the Lion King. Forget the circle of life. Forget the swelling orchestra. Forget the image of a grown lion walking through the rain toward his destiny like it's a triumph. Because what I'm about to walk you through is the psychiatric file hiding underneath a movie your parents put on, thinking it was harmless. Simba isn't a chosen hero. He's a survivor of acute, untreated trauma who spent years without a single adult asking if he was okay. And the end result of that neglect wasn't destiny. It was a breakdown so severe that his fractured mind couldn't tell the difference anymore between his dead father's voice and his own desperate need for permission to kill. Let's slow down. Let's start at the beginning, because every wound has an origin point. And this one is far darker than any animation studio would ever admit out loud. There's a scene early in the film that everyone remembers fondly. A cub lifted into the sunrise, the whole kingdom bowing at once, nature itself apparently pausing to celebrate a single birth. It's beautiful. It's also, if you look at it with any real psychological distance, the very first brick in a weight no child should ever be asked to carry. That cub never got a choice. Before he could form a full sentence, he was already shouldering the expectations of an entire kingdom, already forced to exist as a symbol before he was ever allowed to just be somebody's son. And that early, invisible pressure is exactly why what comes later hits as hard as it does. Because his fall isn't just the loss of a father. It's the simultaneous collapse of an entire identity built on other people's expectations, a role he never got to negotiate or refuse. A cub watches his own father get trampled to death in a gorge after being deliberately lured there by his own uncle. Sit with that for a second, without the music swelling underneath it. This isn't a sad movie moment. This is the founding event of acute post-traumatic stress in a child who hadn't even developed the cognitive tools to process ordinary grief, let alone grief tangled up with the belief that he personally caused it. Because that's the exact message planted in his head in that moment. Run and never come back. What settles into that cub's nervous system isn't "you're innocent." It's "you're guilty, and if you ever return, everyone will know." Clinically speaking, that's the birth of pathological guilt. Guilt with no basis, in fact, that nonetheless roots itself so deep into a child's emotional architecture that it becomes part of his identity. Simba didn't run because he was weak. He ran because an adult, his own blood, manufactured a certainty inside him that disappearing was the only way to survive. And think about what happens in the immediate aftermath when Scar finds that terrified cub standing next to his father's body. There's no comfort in that scene. There's no arm around the shoulder, no gentle acknowledgement of what he just witnessed. Instead, there's a calculated, almost surgical line delivered in a low, controlled voice, suggesting that if anyone ever found out the truth, it would destroy him. That's not grief counseling. That's a threat wrapped in the language of protection, the exact structure used in real coercive control to keep a victim silent. Frame the silence as the victim's own idea, and make sure the person doing the manipulating never has to be the one holding the guilt. A child that age doesn't have the cognitive tools to separate manipulation from genuine concern. All he has is the message itself, repeated in that soft, dangerous tone, and the message becomes gospel. Run, never come back. It's your fault. And a message delivered like that, at the exact moment a nervous system is at its most overwhelmed, doesn't get filed away as opinion. It gets filed away as fact, the kind of foundational, load-bearing belief that shapes every decision a person makes for years, without them ever consciously remembering where it came from. And before any of that, Long before the gorge, long before the stampede, there was already groundwork being laid, quiet and almost invisible. Notice how Scar always shows up in Simba's most emotionally vulnerable moments, praising his bravery right after a scolding from his father, planting small seeds of doubt about his own worth, suggesting dangerous adventures like a trip to a forbidden elephant graveyard. There's a term for that pattern in the literature on childhood psychological abuse, grooming behavior. I'm not describing a cold, distant uncle here. I'm describing an adult who spends months, maybe years, deliberately building false trust with a child, specifically so he can weaponize that trust at exactly the right moment. Every wink, every "I trust you, nephew," wasn't affection. It was rehearsal. It was an adult carefully engineering the precise instant a small child would obey an instruction to stay put and wait for his father. Which is exactly why, when the stampede finally happens, the trauma isn't only the noise, the dust, the sight of his father falling. The trauma is the betrayal underneath it. A child discovering in a single second that the person he trusted most outside his own parents was the one who orchestrated the whole thing. And a developing brain simply doesn't have the architecture to hold catastrophic loss and betrayal at the same time. So it does what it always does when pain outpaces capacity. It fragments the experience, locks pieces of it away in separate compartments, and pushes the most unbearable core of it somewhere hard to reach. That's not weak writing. That's documented paratraumatic dissociation in children exposed to witnessed violence. And then comes the part everybody loves to quote. The carefree philosophy, catchy, colorful, almost hypnotic in how often it repeats. But listen closely to what's actually being taught to that traumatized cub. It isn't resilience, it isn't healing, it's avoidance, dressed up in a jaunty melody. It's the construction of a dissociative coping mechanism so effective that he can bury decades of guilt and grief under a cheerful little mantra every single time the pain tries to surface. His new friends didn't heal him. They taught him to numb himself. And any mental health professional will tell you exactly what I'm about to whisper to you now. Prolonged avoidance isn't recovery. It's a countdown clock. Every year he spends in that jungle, pretending the past doesn't exist, is more pressure building behind a dam that was never built to hold. Notice the geography of that choice too. He didn't go somewhere nearby. He went as far as physically possible from anyone who might recognize him, call him by his old name, force him to remember who he was before that night. That has a name as well. Generalized avoidant behavior, the kind where suffering becomes so unbearable, a person rearranges their entire existence, location, routine, social circle, just to minimize any chance of running into the original trigger. And the cruelest part is that it worked. It worked for years, no visible crisis. And that's exactly the kind of surface-level stability that fools everyone around him, including himself, into believing he's healed, when really he's just anesthetized, quietly waiting for the day the anesthesia stops working. Now think about what happens the moment Nala walks back into his life. The film frames that reunion as romantic, almost magical, a relief after years apart. Psychologically, what actually happens there is a catastrophic trigger event. Nala's presence doesn't bring pure joy to adult Simba. It brings the sudden, violent return of everything he spent years trying to bury alive. The smell of home, the memory of his mother, the memory of the kingdom, of his own name before it became that lion who disappeared. All of it floods a nervous system that never had time to prepare for that kind of confrontation. There's a clinical term for this too. One any trauma-informed therapist would recognize immediately watching that reunion scene play out. Trauma memory reactivation through associative cues. Her scent, her voice, the way she looks at him, all of it functions like a single key, turned all at once in a lock that had been sealed for years. And the problem with unlocking something that fast, with zero therapeutic preparation, is that everything behind that door comes rushing out, unfiltered, unordered, with no time to process any of it. Simba didn't get to work through it gradually. He got flooded all at once, in the middle of a fight, in broad daylight, with no real emotional safety net nearby, beyond two friends who had no idea any of this history even existed. And it's precisely that state of emotional flooding, that sudden violent reopening of a wound that never actually healed, that leaves him at his most psychologically fragile. Exactly the kind of vulnerability an experienced manipulator can smell from a distance, the way a predator recognizes a wounded animal. And that's the exact moment the most dangerous character in this entire story steps into frame. Rafiki, I need you to look at this character differently from now on, because the way the film presents him is, at best, dishonest. He isn't a gentle sage guiding a lost young man back to the right path. Watch that jungle sequence again with a clinical eye. He stalks Simba at night, in the dark, when his target is exhausted and his psychological defenses are at their lowest possible point. He speaks in riddles, broken sentences, confusing nonsense laced with cryptic authority. Exactly the kind of disorienting language used in classic coercive control tactics. The deliberate blending of confusion with forged spiritual authority, designed to make a victim doubt his own grip on reality. And notice the full sequence, because it follows something close to a textbook playbook for psychological capture. First, physical isolation, dragging the target into unfamiliar territory, far from any support system, in the middle of the night, deep in dense brush. Second, sleep deprivation, chasing someone who's already exhausted, never allowing a pause, never letting the nervous system stabilize. Third, deliberate cognitive confusion, speaking in riddles, laughing for no clear reason, blending wisdom with nonsense, so the target can never predict what's coming and therefore never mount a real defense. Fourth, physical shock, literally breaking the possibility of a rational escape. And only after all of that, the fifth step, planting the new belief. This isn't ancestral wisdom lovingly passed down. This is coercive manipulation, executed with surgical precision on a young man whose defenses were already in ruins before Rafiki ever showed up. And when words alone don't do the job, he escalates to physical violence. That famous funny moment where he cracks Simba over the head, the one everyone's laughed at since childhood, is, under any serious analysis of coercive behavior, a deliberate act of violence used to break someone's psychological resistance. That's not an eccentric old sage being playful. It's a documented tactic in indoctrination processes, the unexpected physical shock, delivered at the exact moment the target tries to pull away, tries to refuse the message, tries to protect an equilibrium he spent years rebuilding. And what Rafiki plants, right after breaking that final line of defense, is the single most dangerous idea you can put inside a mind already destabilized by unresolved grief. Your father is alive in a way. Sit with the weight of that for a second. For anyone carrying unprocessed guilt over a parent's death, hearing a spiritual authority figure say that parent still lives on inside them isn't comfort. It's a sentence. It's the surgical reopening, with zero anesthesia, of a wound his brain had spent an entire life trying to keep sealed shut. And it's right after that, exhausted, sleep-deprived, physically struck, emotionally dismantled, soaked in a storm he can barely tell is real anymore, that Simba looks into the water and then up at the sky. Pay very close attention here, because this is where the fairy tale ends and the psychiatry begins. What the film shows you is beautiful. A constellation reshaping itself into a face. A deep, paternal voice rolling in over thunder, telling him to remember who he is. But I need to ask you an uncomfortable question. What would you call it outside of a movie theater? In the real world, if a young adult who hasn't slept in days, who is just physically struck, who is in full emotional collapse under extreme stress, suddenly sees his dead father's face forming in storm clouds and hears that voice speaking directly to him, you'd call it an audio-visual hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and acute trauma. Full stop. There is no other clinical reading of that scene. It is a textbook portrait of a brief psychotic episode. exactly the kind of mental fracture documented in cases of extreme, prolonged stress, where a mind that can no longer bear the weight simply creates an exit. And in this case, that exit arrived wearing the face of the only moral authority he ever fully trusted. Sleep deprivation on its own, with no other contributing factor, is enough to produce transient psychotic symptoms in people with zero prior history of mental illness. It shows up again and again in cases of forced extended wakefulness. Simple visual distortions first, shadows that move wrong, shapes that start resembling faces, then more complex hallucinations, voices, full figures, entire scenes playing out in front of exhausted eyes. Now stack that on top of a lifetime of unresolved guilt. Stack it on top of a recent physical assault. Stack it on top of a reunion that ripped open every wound he spent years avoiding. Stack it on top of an actual real storm, lightning, wind, a body edging toward hypothermia, adrenaline maxed out. There was no stable neurological ground left for that animal to stand on, no way left to reliably separate what was real from what wasn't. His brain was quite literally in a state of emergency, and the specific content of that hallucination isn't random either. Even a fractured mind tends to organize collapse around whatever it internalized as its highest moral authority. For Simba, that was always his father. So when the psyche desperately needs external permission to do something it could never authorize on its own, it reaches for the most powerful voice in its own emotional archive. That's why the hallucination had that exact face, that exact tone, those exact words he needed most to hear. That wasn't Mufasa's spirit crossing over from beyond death. That was Simba, in absolute desperation, granting himself permission he never had the courage to grant alone. Because look at the structure of it plainly. A young man, broken, guilty, sleep-deprived, physically assaulted by a manipulator, suddenly receives a divine mission to eliminate his own uncle and reclaim power. That is not destiny. That is the textbook blueprint for manufacturing a weapon out of a wounded person. It's how coercive movements throughout history have always operated. Find someone fragile, break down their last psychological defenses, implant a higher voice telling them they have a mission, then point them in a direction, fully convinced that the drive burning in their chest isn't even theirs. It belongs to something bigger, something they're no longer allowed to refuse. Before I keep pulling this thread with you, I need to actually stop for a second and say something real. If you're new here, welcome to Animation Files. This is exactly the kind of deep dive we do on this channel, taking movies you grew up trusting and looking at them the way a forensic psychiatrist would. If any part of this has connected with you so far, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now before you forget, because we go this deep on a different film every single week. And honestly, this one only gets darker from here. He gets up after the vision. The film frames that moment as an awakening, a healing, a redemption arc clicking into place. But I need to show you what's actually happening behind those newly determined eyes. That isn't mental clarity. That's advanced dissociation. It's the specific, unsettling calm that mental health professionals recognize in patients who just came out of an acute psychotic episode and, for a moment, found a narrative that organizes the internal chaos, even when that narrative has completely detached from reality. He walks back toward Pride Rock through pouring rain with that fixed, unblinking stare. No hesitation, no doubt anywhere on his face. The original story wants you to applaud this as the moment the hero finally accepts his destiny. I want you to see something else entirely. I want you to see a young man walking in a trance, guided not by his own conscious will, but by a mission implanted through manipulation and mental collapse. He isn't healed in that moment. He's been armed, and when he finally reaches Pride Rock and confronts Scar, and the truth about his father's death finally surfaces, what unfolds next isn't poetic justice. It's the final detonation of years of compressed trauma, deliberate manipulation, and a mind that can no longer tell the difference between revenge and divine will. Notice the small detail almost nobody talks about. At the height of the confrontation, Scar tries one more time to rewrite the narrative, tries to push the blame for Mufasa's death back onto Simba, tries to reactivate that exact same pathological guilt trigger planted decades earlier, and for a second, it actually works. Simba hesitates, pulls back, almost accepts the role of the guilty one again, the role he'd been carrying since he was a cub. It's only when Scar, unable to help himself, confesses the crime out loud, thinking no one else could possibly hear, that the balance of power finally flips. And once that external confession lines up with what his fractured mind had already decided during the hallucination, there's nothing left inside him strong enough to hold back what happens next. His body moves before any rational part of him can step in. The fight ends with Scar torn apart by the very hyenas he spent his whole life using as tools. A satisfying ending for the plot, no doubt. Psychologically, what actually happened up there was a regicide committed by a young man convinced, through systematic manipulation and psychiatric collapse, that he was carrying out the will of a dead father who never actually spoke to him at all. And there's something worth sitting with in that final image of the hyenas turning on Scar the moment he stops being useful to them. It mirrors, almost too perfectly, the exact structure of coercive systems in general, whether we're talking about a fictional pride of lions or documented patterns in real extremist and exploitative groups. Loyalty inside those systems is never actually loyalty. It's transaction. The moment the person at the top can no longer offer protection, resources, or status, the very tools he built to maintain control turn immediately into the instruments of his destruction. Scar spent years positioning the hyenas as weapons he could point at anyone who threatened him. He never once considered that a weapon has no actual allegiance to the hand holding it, only to whichever hand currently feeds it. That's not loyalty, that's leverage, and leverage only flows one direction, toward power, never toward the person who used to hold it. It's worth noticing, too, that Simba, in that final moment, becomes almost a mirror image of the very manipulation that shaped him. A confused, frightened creature acting under the influence of an implanted belief, driven by forces bigger than his own conscious will. The difference is that his belief happened to align with the truth about what actually happened in that gorge. But the mechanism producing his certainty, the sleep deprivation, the manufactured vision, the manipulated sense of divine mission, was structurally identical to the exact manipulation Scar himself had used on him as a child. He didn't defeat the manipulation that shaped his entire life. He simply became its final expression. And the saddest detail in the entire story is what doesn't happen afterward. Nobody, at any point, sits down with that lion and asks how he's doing. The whole kingdom celebrates a new king's rise. Nobody asks about the sleepless nights. Nobody asks about the voice in the clouds. Nobody offers him the one treatment that would have actually changed this story, genuine listening, with no mystical mission attached, no destiny to perform, just presence and care, offered early enough that pain never had to disguise itself as prophecy just to become bearable. He becomes king. The savannah celebrates. The score swells into triumph. But he never, not once after that, actually processes the original trauma in any healthy way. He never confronts the guilt properly. He just traded one escape, running to the jungle and hiding behind a catchy song, for another escape. Disappearing into a mystical mission he built himself in a moment of total desperation just to justify his own pain. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The next generation grows up hearing that same mystical phrase, remember who you are. They grow up believing dead kings genuinely watch from the sky, guiding decisions, whispering instructions during moments of crisis. And nobody, anywhere in that entire kingdom, ever stops to ask whether what actually saved the kingdom wasn't the intervention of some ancestral spirit at all, but the mental collapse of a kid who never had anyone safe to turn to. Because that savannah never had any magic in it. It had silence. It had negligence. It had one small, terrified cub carrying guilt that was never his to carry. And in the end, an entire system embodied by Rafiki, by the complete absence of a single responsible adult that chose to manufacture a mystical savior instead of simply sitting with that kid and asking, "Are you okay?" He was never okay. And maybe, somewhere in you, you've felt some version of that too, even if you never had the words for it. That particular emptiness that shows up right after the triumphant music fades and the silence rushes back in. That emptiness is the most honest part of the entire film. Think about how many stories from your childhood follow this exact same blueprint, and nobody ever taught you to look for it. A child suffers a loss too big to process. No adult intervenes in time. The pain accumulates in silence, dressed up as growth, dressed up as adventure, dressed up as a cheerful song playing while the wound stays wide open underneath. And when that pain finally detonates, the culture around it prefers to call it destiny, prefers to call it courage, prefers to call it a hero's journey rather than admit out loud that what it actually just witnessed was a mental breakdown nobody helped prevent. I don't dig into this stuff to ruin your childhood for fun. I do it to show you that the psychological pain was always sitting right there, wedged between one funny scene and the next, waiting for someone willing to actually look without flinching. Because as long as we keep calling mental collapse destiny, keep calling manipulation ancient wisdom, keep calling hallucination magic, we're going to keep romanticizing the exact same patterns in real people around us. In the friend who suddenly found their purpose after years of being lost. In the acquaintance who had an epiphany following a crisis nobody bothered to call by its real name. And think about the shape of the cycle closing itself at the end of this story. A cub is born, lifted up in front of an entire kingdom, carrying a symbolic weight from the very first second of his life that no child should have to bear. Years later, that same cub, now grown, now broken, climbs that same rock again, this time guided by a hallucination, by a manipulated mission, by pain nobody ever actually helped him work through. And the film ends exactly the way it began. Another cub, lifted into the same sunrise, in front of the same applause. And nobody in that entire cheering crowd stops to ask whether that beautiful cycle is actually just the same pattern of emotional neglect repeating itself, generation after generation, dressed up as tradition, dressed up as destiny, dressed up as the circle of life. Because that's how unresolved trauma works, whether it's happening on a hand-drawn savanna or in a house down the street from yours. It doesn't disappear just because the next generation was born under applause. It waits, quiet, patient, hidden behind a catchy little phrase repeated like a mantra, until the right night, the right storm, comes along to make it happen all over again. If this reframing hit you the way it hit me the first time I connected these dots, do me a favor and smash that like button, and drop a comment telling me honestly, do you still see that vision in the clouds as real ancestral magic? Or do you see it now for what it actually is? The sad, brutal portrait of a kid having a full psychotic break with nobody around to catch him. That kind of engagement is genuinely what keeps this channel alive, so it means more than you probably think. And before you go, one last thing. Think back to the last time someone told you they got over something impossibly fast, that they suddenly found a mission, that they heard a voice that resolved everything in a single crisis-filled night. Maybe it's worth asking, gently, the thing nobody ever asked that lion. Have you actually been sleeping? Has anyone asked how you're really doing without expecting a rehearsed answer back? Because sometimes what we call destiny is just the prettier name we give to pain nobody was brave enough to sit with in time. That's exactly why this channel exists, to listen to what nobody else listened to put a clinical name on what the fairy tale insists on calling magic. If this one messed with your head a little, subscribe, because we're doing this again next week on a movie you definitely didn't see coming. One more thing before the screen goes dark. Notice how differently this whole story reads once you strip away the score and the sunrise lighting. A frightened child, isolated by design, manipulated by the one adult who claimed to love him most, left without a single safe person to process any of it with, running until running stopped working, then breaking in the exact way an untreated nervous system eventually breaks under that kind of prolonged pressure. None of that is villain origin story material. None of that is chosen one mythology. It's just what happens to a mind that carries something too heavy for too long without anyone ever reaching out a hand. And maybe that's the real reason this particular story has stuck with generations of people who grew up watching it on repeat, long before any of us had the language to explain why. Somewhere underneath the songs and the sweeping vistas, a part of every kid watching recognized something true about carrying pain alone, about being told to run and never look back, about needing so badly for someone, anyone, even a hallucination wearing a familiar voice, to finally say, it's okay to stop pretending everything is fine. So here's what I actually want you to take from this, more than any single clinical term I've thrown at you tonight. If you're the friend who always seems fine, who bounced back from something fast, who found their sudden mission or their sudden peace after a crisis nobody talked about out loud, you don't have to keep performing that. And if you're the one watching someone else do it, maybe don't just admire how quickly they moved on. Ask them how they're actually sleeping. That's the whole video. Thanks for sitting in the dark with me for this one. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Drop your take in the comments, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.